I was away for just 4 days, filming a rare assignment in Hawaii. When I got back, my peaceful lakefront property had been transformed into a fully developed home neighborhood. 101 pastel-colored homes, a metal gate at the entrance, community regulations, even a newsletter listing me as an upcoming resident. Families were grilling, kids were running around, and the dock I built with my own hands was now lined with folding chairs. The woman in charge looked me right in the eye and said I had 30 days to fall in linea or leave. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional, a coordinated move. Think something like this couldn't happen to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm Nate, 35 years old, and I run a small documentary film studio. This lakeside land came from a decade of relentless work. It was where I planned to build a modest cabin, a quiet escape after long shoots in places like Hawaii, Iceland, and Peru. Every trip reminded me why I needed a place like this to decompress. I'd just spent 2 weeks filming a piece on small-town politics, which, in hindsight, felt like a vacation compared to what I walked into. Imagine pulling into your own driveway, expecting to find your usual slice of calm, maybe a few weeds, some fallen leaves. Instead, it looked like someone had shrunk an entire suburb and dropped it right onto your land. I sat there, stunned, staring at a pop-up village of pastel matchbox homes. A shiny HOA sign stood planted by the old cedar trees. Surveillance cameras blinked at me like they'd been expecting my arrival. Each tiny house was painted with care so cheerful it could make a kindergarten classroom look drab. There were tiny, working mailboxes, pristine white fences strong enough to lean on, and even a street lamp system that actually worked. Off to one side, I spotted a miniature post office, probably for delivering threats to residents who dared question the HOA's authority. And right beside it, a veterinary clinic, complete with a little red cross painted on the side. Everything about the scene felt wrong. It had that eerie, too perfect charm you find in influencer-targeted resort villages in Hawaii, aesthetic but lifeless. What really shook me, though, wasn't the surreal sight, it was the level of detail. Whoever did this had poured real money and effort into the project. The sidewalks were genuine concrete, not props. The lighting system was wired into an underground network, something that would have taken permits and licensed contractors. The signs weren't makeshift either, they were real metal, mounted properly, following some absurd traffic law for dolls. Looking back, I should have seen this for what it was, an organized, well-planned invasion, executed with unnerving precision. But in the moment, I was too shocked to think clearly, wondering if I was just burned out and hallucinating. I eventually turned off the ignition and walked toward the village. That's when I saw something that truly chilled me. Warning signs mounted on the trees around the edge of my land. They had that official font you see on government property, making them feel weirdly legit. Private property and no trespassing. Only they weren't keeping outsiders off my land. They were warning me to stay away from the new village. Something about that hit hard, like someone had walked into my home, moved all my furniture, and then told me not to touch anything. The fake security cameras were the final straw. They were placed with precision, clearly positioned to cover every inch of the community, except they weren't aimed outward for protection. They were all facing my house. Somebody had built a surveillance network on my land to monitor me. From a distance, the cameras looked real, blinking red lights, weatherproof casing, but I suspected they were just there to intimidate. Maybe I should have called the police right away, but I've always tried to handle things face to face before calling in reinforcements. I figured there had to be some kind of explanation. Then I found the sign that spelled everything out, or at least tried to. A large, glossy placard stood near the center of the mini town, mounted on a post that had been driven deep into my land. It read, Community Beautification Project No. 1A, sponsored by Lakeside Gardens HA, not HOA HA. The sign proudly called the design tropical minimalist, like they were aiming to turn this place into the next Airbnb hotspot. And listed at the bottom was the project manager's name, Brenda Morrison. Instead of exploding in rage, I felt a strange calm take over. The fake cameras, the signs, the manicured roads, it all pointed to something methodical. This wasn't random vandalism or some elaborate neighborhood joke. It had been in the works for a while, long enough to order professional signage and lay underground wiring. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow and confident, like they belonged here more than I did. I turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching. Her smile had the polished warmth of a church fundraiser volunteer, but it made my skin crawl. She didn't ask who I was, didn't even introduce herself. She pointed at my driveway and said, "You'll need to move your vehicle, or it'll be towed by noon. You're blocking access." The arrogance in her tone stunned me. A stranger was standing on my property, warning me to move my car from my own driveway. But what struck me even more was how casual she sounded, like she was explaining gravity to someone too dense to understand it. I just stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my head around it. A complete stranger was issuing orders on my land, in the middle of what looked like an illegal construction zone. If they thought I was going to roll over while they set up lawn chairs and sun umbrellas on my land, they clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. Brenda Morrison lived in what I can only describe as a shrine to beige, a house so stripped of personality it felt like color itself had been outlawed by executive order. Her home looked like it had been designed under a government-issued neutrality order sometime around 2003. Everything inside was some muted shade of beige, cream, or alt-white, arranged so carefully it felt like a museum, one where human presence might violate some unwritten code. She answered the door with a sugary smile so overdone it could have given a healthy person a glucose spike, and she welcomed me in as though she'd been preparing for this visit all week. Maybe she had. Even now, I'm stunned by how composed she was, as if dealing with angry property owners was just part of her morning routine. It looked like someone had printed out a Pinterest board and dumped it onto my forest. She offered me a cup of coffee from a sleek machine that probably cost more than my monthly rent and gestured toward the living room so pristine it felt like sitting in it would trigger a silent alarm. Every cushion seemed measured, every object perfectly symmetrical. I declined, mostly because I was afraid to touch anything in that sterile, airbrushed environment. Brenda eased into her chair with the polished grace of someone who'd mastered the art of pretending to care while caring not at all. She wielded politeness like a scalpel, sharp, practiced, and just friendly enough to make you second-guess your own outrage. When I finally told her why I was there, she tilted her head with the sort of puzzled empathy you'd expect from someone hearing a distant, unfamiliar language. It was the expression of a person who simply couldn't grasp why anyone would object to having their private land improved without so much as a warning. "Oh, Mr. Nate," she said. She never used my last name, just that overly familiar tone, like I was a long-lost neighbor who'd wandered back by accident. "This is a community project that's already been voted on and approved through the proper channels. Progress doesn't wait for individual preferences, especially when those preferences might go against the shared vision of the neighborhood." She spoke the way you'd explain subtraction to a confused kindergartner. I wish I could say I stayed calm, but I didn't. I told her flat out that I didn't care who had voted on what or how many imaginary committees had nodded their heads. This was my land. I wanted every miniature house gone within 48 hours, otherwise, I'd be calling both my lawyer and the cops. That's when she pulled out the documents, and not casually, as this wasn't some frantic shuffling through a drawer. It was like she'd rehearsed this exact moment. She reached into a folder that seemed to materialize out of thin air, like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, and laid out a series of papers stamped with letterheads and peppered with enough legal jargon to cause a nosebleed. Signatures, permits, support from neighboring property owners. My stomach flipped when I saw one name in particular. George. George lived 2 houses down. A retired accountant. He'd always come across as the most reasonable person on the block. If anyone would have spoken up about something like this, it was George. Seeing his name on those documents felt like realizing your dog had been filing reports to the cat this whole time. "This zone falls under a declarative use designation," Brenda said smoothly. "By entering the premises, you're agreeing to those terms." Her voice stayed as syrupy as ever, but every word carried a calculated precision. "This project has overwhelming support from your fellow residents," she added, as though the matter had already been settled in stone. Then she handed me a check for $100 like it was some grand gesture deserving a spotlight and a brass band. $100. Was I being rented by the hour or bought out for life? I stared at that check like it might burst into flames in my hand. It was so surreal I half expected to find hidden cameras capturing my reaction for later use in some legal trap. The idea that they were offering to pay me on my own land was so brazen it almost impressed me. Like a thief who pickpockets you and then hands you an invoice. I handed the check back with the kind of calm that should be taught in conflict resolution seminars. Then I repeated my demand. 48 hours. Clear the entire thing. That's when I saw it. A subtle shift in her expression. The smile stayed, but something behind it cooled. Like someone had just dropped the thermostat by 5 degrees. I got my first look at the person hiding behind this sweetness. She folded the check with almost ceremonial care, slid it back into her folder, and said, "I understand that you're upset, Mr. Nate, but litigation can be costly for everyone. Often, it's wiser to consider what path benefits the most people." Then, with unnerving calm, "Sometimes, those who resist change find it far harder than those who embrace it." Was that a threat? Maybe, maybe not. And that ambiguity was the point. The words sounded like friendly advice, but the delivery had the chill of a veiled ultimatum. I walked out of her house feeling like I'd just been quietly mugged by someone's grandma, the kind who runs bake sales by day and buries secrets in her backyard at night. When the 48-hour deadline passed, nothing had changed. Not a single tiny home moved an inch. Instead, I received a $500 citation for breaching whole landscaping CODESA rules that supposedly applied to my private property. So now it wasn't just that she'd taken over my land, she was billing me for the inconvenience. But what really made my skin crawl wasn't the fine itself. It was the handwriting. My name, scrawled in a style I hadn't used since I was a teenager. That's when the pieces clicked. This wasn't some gradual takeover that happened while I slept. It happened while I was in Hawaii, walking beaches and chasing sunsets, thinking I'd finally found peace. Turns out, a single vacation is all it takes for a candy-colored nightmare to sprout roots in your own backyard. So next time someone tells you to unplug, take a break, get off the grid for a willy, tell them sure. Right after they hire a lawyer to house sit, the emergency home meeting was held in the so-called community center building that somehow managed to be both cramped and cavernous, like the architect had only ever seen blueprints in theory. The air was thick with the scent of overbrewed coffee and self-importance. The walls were plastered with pictures of Brenda's over-polished smile standing next to various local officials, and most of whom probably had no clue they were being used for HOA propaganda. I got there early, hoping to catch George before the meeting started and ask him about the signature, privately, but he was nowhere in sight. Instead, I found myself surrounded by unfamiliar faces and neighbors I barely recognized, all wearing. The expressions on the faces around me ranged from passive curiosity to outright disdain. It felt like walking into a courtroom where the sentence had already been decided. I was just there so the show could go on. Brenda brought the meeting to order with a voice that carried the stern weight of either a federal judge or a middle school principal confronting a cafeteria food fight. She announced we were gathered to discuss a property issue that, according to her, was threatening the harmony of the community. And just like that, I was painted as the villain. I was the disruption for daring to object to having my land taken over in plain sight. Her ability to warp reality was almost admirable in the same way a hurricane is, dangerous, devastating, but undeniably effective. Then she revealed what she called a resident petition in favor of the beautification initiative. The timing was theatrical. She'd clearly rehearsed the moment down to the pause before the reveal. The pages were filled with signatures from people I'd never met, supposed neighbors who had somehow remained hidden until now, summoned like loyal extras in a bad legal drama. The petition demanded the project continue indefinitely and that I be fined even more for resisting. I actually had to stop and just look at her, wondering if we were even operating in the same reality anymore. She was holding a document filled with names, asserting that nearly every home in the area supported converting my private property into their personal community hub. When I asked to review the petition myself, like any reasonable person would when accused of wrecking neighborhood unity, Brenda just smiled that laminated smile of hers and said, sweetly, that HOA documents were confidential and viewable only by board members. It was like being tried for a crime I didn't even know I'd committed, in a courtroom where the judge, jury, and prosecutor were all wearing matching HOA polos. "If you undermine the harmony we've built here," she said, "it won't just be a legal issue. You'll be remembered as the man who ruined everything." Then came the final blow. She announced my fines were increasing to $1,500, and if I didn't pay within 30 days, a lien would be filed on my property. A lien for daring to oppose a construction project I never approved on my own land. I'd love to tell you I kept my composure, that I responded with calm, rational eloquence. But honestly, I was so blindsided, I couldn't string 3 words together. And looking back, that was probably exactly what she wanted. The more unhinged I looked, the more she seemed like the voice of reason. Then it got even weirder. A man stood up clutching a note card. He looked terrified, like he was reading under duress. "We just want to preserve the community," he mumbled, barely loud enough to hear, glancing over at Brenda like she was holding a trigger. He sat back down immediately, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Brenda lit up like a kindergarten teacher watching her favorite student recite the alphabet without stumbling. She nodded, turned to someone off to the side, and just like that, my mic cut off mid-sentence as I tried to respond. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. They could speak. I couldn't. They had the platform. I had static. My voice had been silenced electronically and metaphorically by people who controlled both the tools and the narrative. The meeting ended with me officially declared a threat to neighborhood harmony. I walked out to my car, sat behind the wheel, and just tried to absorb what had happened. That's when I saw George. He appeared at the passenger side window, glancing around like he was about to pass me a flash drive full of state secrets. Without waiting for an invite, he climbed into the seat and started talking fast. "That signature?" "Not mine," he said. "No greeting. No small talk. I don't sign anything without reading every line 3 times. I'd never agree to that circus on your land." I felt like someone had finally tossed me a life preserver after watching me sink in silence. But what he said next didn't make things any easier. George told me about a family on Maple Street, of the ones with the cheerful garden and the friendly golden retriever. They'd clashed with Brenda the year before over a fence height issue. What began as a minor disagreement escalated into a relentless stream of legal threats and HOA penalties. Eventually, they vanished. Just gone. Over one weekend. I'd assumed they'd moved for work. Nope. They were casualties just like me. Victims of Brenda's long game. A slow, calculated plan to take over the entire neighborhood one parcel at a time. "She's been working toward this for years," George said. "This isn't about rules or community. This is about control." They hadn't just stolen my land. They'd hijacked the story. That's when I realized I had to create a new one. Louder, clearer, mine. For the next 3 days, I sat staring at business cards for every property lawyer within 100 miles. I picked up my phone and set it down again and again, like I was trying to defuse a bomb and couldn't remember which wire was safe. My brain ran endless calculations: legal fees versus property value, stress versus principal, fight versus flight, bankruptcy versus surrender. Maybe I should have just sold it all, let the pastel invaders have their way, start over somewhere else, build a cabin farther from the chaos. I'd bought this place for peace. After years of globetrotting documentary work, I wanted a sanctuary, not a battleground, and certainly not to go to war with a suburban monarch armed with binders full of bylaws and a smile colder than windshield washer fluid in January. But if I gave up, what happened to the next guy? Who would be the next neighbor to watch their rights dissolve because I was too exhausted or scared to fight back? The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my life making documentaries about power, injustice, and the importance of standing your ground. Yet here I was hesitating to document the very fight I was in. I've spent my career telling stories about people standing up to abuse of power, a David versus Goliath battles fought against corporations, corrupt officials, and relentless bureaucracies. But I never imagined I'd become the subject of one of those stories myself. There's something radically different about going from the observer to the person caught in the middle of the storm. Sarah's law office was the polar opposite of Brenda's clinical, catalog-perfect house. Her workspace was a chaotic maze of law books piled like unstable skyscrapers, case files strewn across every flat surface, and the air thick with focused energy. It looked like a legal war zone, And somehow, I felt safer in that mess than I ever did in Brenda's HOA kingdom. Sarah greeted me with razor-sharp attention, the kind that made you feel like your case was the only one that mattered. Within minutes of flipping through my documents, she was already asking smart, surgical questions, questions that exposed depths of the situation I hadn't even considered. "This isn't just a dispute over land," she said, spreading out my photographs like crime scene evidence. "This is structured extortion under the disguise of civic improvement." It was like watching someone peel back a disguise. Sarah wasted no time identifying the true strategy beneath Brenda's friendly branding and pastel aesthetics. What I'd brushed off as obsessive micromanagement was actually a finely tuned schema system engineered to force property transfers using legal loopholes, intimidation, and administrative pressure. She highlighted 3 specific clauses on a copy of the bylaws. "They're exploiting a loophole that treats your lot as a shared-use corridor," she explained. "It's obscure but it's beatable. If someone leaves items on your property and ignores formal removal notices, ownership can transfer back to you under certain conditions. But they're counting on you not knowing the steps." Sarah was already 3 moves ahead, spotting legal angles I couldn't see after weeks of stress and sleepless nights spent questioning my own sanity and my grip on reality. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope flicker back to life. Her clarity, her competency, it was contagious. After drowning in uncertainty, I was finally in the room with someone who had a lifeline. Then she pulled up something on her computer screen that reignited my anger to full burn. It was the HOA newsletter. There was Brenda, smiling like a local celebrity, beneath a headline that read, "Support the Tiny Village Project. Goal, $10,000 to expand our shared recreational space." She was crowdfunding improvements on my property without permission, soliciting donations from neighbors and strangers to upgrade and expand a stolen development she had no legal right to build in the first place. Sarah's assessment was blunt. "This edges into fraud. She's raising funds based on misinformation about who owns the land and who approved the project." Brenda hadn't just taken my property. She'd fined me for objecting, marketed it as a community attraction, and was now asking for donations to make it even harder to remove. It was like someone stealing your car, charging you a fee for it being in their garage, and then launching a GoFundMe to install heated seats for their own comfort. I stood up and started pacing. That furious kind of pacing you see in crime dramas, the kind that makes you worry someone's going to end up punching drywall. Brenda's audacity was staggering. She had taken my private retreat, turned it into a public park, and then charged me for the privilege while asking the crowd for more. Sarah watched me like a scientist observing a cornered animal. Then she delivered the line that would change everything. "They're throwing a summer festival this weekend to celebrate the project and raise more funds. Public events are fair game for recording in this state. Anything said theory, especially fundraising appeals, can be admissible in court." Her plan was simple but devastating. We'd attend the festival as concerned residents, document everything legally, and gather first-hand evidence of fraudulent claims and misuse of public trust. It would arm us for civil litigation and potentially criminal charges. She handed me a recording device small enough to fit inside a pen, and went over the legal do's and don'ts like a field briefing. No hidden surveillance, no entrapment, just lawful, clear documentation. "If you really want to bring this down," she said, eyes locked on mine, "you don't fight it head-on, you turn their own rules into the trap." For the first time, I had more than frustration. I had strategy, direction, backup. But walking into Brenda's festival felt like strolling into a wolf den with steak in your pockets. Still, by the time I reached my truck, I'd mentally planned out 3 plays. If they were staging some HOA-themed theater, I was going to rewrite the script. I didn't just want my land back, I wanted a permanent record, a truth set in stone, proof that this pastel-colored lie had tried to rewrite reality and failed. The HOA festival smelled like funnel cakes and perfectly staged delusion. I was already in Cydia, badge clipped, camera rolling. Brenda had turned the area around the tiny village into a full-blown community carnival. Food trucks sold overpriced corn dogs. A bounce house bobbed dangerously close to violating multiple safety codes. And at the center of it all stood Brenda, basking in attention from a small stage like a city councilwoman unveiling a landmark bill. The whole neighborhood had turned out, even people I didn't recognize, probably drawn by Facebook invites, word-of-mouth hype, or the promise of free snow cones in a new community park. And there I was, standing in the middle of it all, holding a hidden recorder in my jacket, watching kids play in my stolen backyard like it was a public attraction, watching families take selfies next to picket fences built without permission, watching my sanctuary become their playground. And they had no idea. Looking back, it still stuns me that I walked into the middle of all that chaos with a recording device tucked in my pocket. But sometimes, the safest place to hide is in plain view, especially when everyone expects you to be furious and confrontational, not calm, composed, and quietly calculating. The whole festival had an eerie, dreamlike quality, as if I'd stepped into a staged social experiment designed to test not just my sanity, but my belief in other people. Sarah had positioned herself strategically near the stage, armed with a professional-looking camera and a cover story about being a freelance journalist documenting local events for a publication that didn't exist. That was the brilliance of her plan. Everything we were doing was entirely legal and looked perfectly normal. Just another public gathering being recorded, like thousands of others across the country. In fact, Brenda had encouraged everyone to film and photograph the event, likely planning to use the footage in future fundraising campaigns to push her so-called community revitalization even further. I wandered through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, listening for anything useful, trying not to look like someone covertly collecting evidence. Most people were genuinely enthusiastic about the project. They praised its design, admired its charm, and spoke glowingly of Brenda as if she were some kind of modern Jane Jacobs, reshaping the neighborhood for the better. For a brief moment, I questioned myself. Was I wrong to be angry? Should I just embrace what they called an improvement and accept that my once simple lakefront had become a centerpiece of community joy? But that feeling passed quickly. Admiration doesn't pay property taxes. Cheerful children playing on your land don't erase the violation of having that land taken from you without consent or compensation. Near the cider booth, a woman leaned in and whispered, "They told us not to speak to anyone with a clipboard." Then she flashed a too bright smile and vanished into the crowd. How many others had been briefed, coached, warned? The deeper I looked, the more the cracks showed. Conversations felt rehearsed. Parents smiled too broadly. Kids bounced in the inflatable castle while their parents exchanged knowing glances, an unspoken agreement to maintain the illusion of unity. It was like watching actors in a community theater production about harmony. Only the script was written to erase dissent. Then Brenda raised her glass, and the whole festival seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. She addressed the crowd with the self-assurance of a monarch. Every word met with applause as if she were solving world hunger instead of announcing local construction. "Thanks to your generous contributions," she beamed, her syrupy voice grating against every nerve in my body. "We've expanded the project to include the beautiful lakefront area, enhancing recreational opportunities for our community and beyond." There it was, out loud, on record, a public admission that she had used donated money to expand a project onto private land that she didn't own. My land, my stolen property, now transformed into a civic centerpiece under false pretenses. I was so focused on recording every syllable that I didn't notice Frank Morrison until he was already behind me. He approached like a predator moving through tall grass, smooth and deliberate. Brenda's husband, just as I had pictured him, decked out in a designer polo shirt that probably cost more than my rent, a gleaming gold watch catching the sunlight like a warning signal, and a slick demeanor honed through years of calculated intimidation. His hand landed on my shoulder with just enough pressure to send a message. Not enough to cross a legal line, but more than enough to make the intent clear. "I'm choosing not to hurt you right now. You might want to be careful," he said in a low voice, barely louder than the background noise from the stage and the crowd. "This neighborhood can be difficult for people who get involved in things that don't concern them." He paused, letting the implication settle. "Sometimes people who stir the pot find they've created a mess they can't clean up. Know what I mean?" Was this really happening? A veiled threat at a public festival, in broad daylight, with cameras rolling and dozens of people nearby? The audacity was staggering. It was like watching someone rob a store while live streaming the crime with their name tagged in the corner. And Frank wasn't done. With a smirk, he pulled out his phone and played a video clip. It was me recorded from across the HOA common area one evening the week before. I had been checking on the tiny houses, trying to figure out how extensive the project really was, but the angle and lighting made it look like I was up to something shady, creeping around after dark like I was planning vandalism. In this state, Frank said casually, never losing his polished smile, trespassing after hours is a serious matter, especially when there's video suggesting malicious intent toward community property. Then he leaned in slightly. People who create problems often find that those problems followed them home. His words carried the weight of someone who had used threats like these before and followed through. Someone who knew exactly how to weaponize legal ambiguity and social pressure to make a person's life fall apart quietly, piece by piece. I turned away, only to see something even more disturbing. My camera caught a man shoving a stack of ballots into the hose locked drop box near the refreshment table. When he noticed me watching, he walked toward me, smiling with the same unnatural friendliness that everyone here seemed to wear like a mask. I kept my smile in place and nodded as if everything were fine, but inside, every instinct screamed danger, like standing in a room full of gasoline with a lit match in my hand. This had clearly escalated far beyond property lines and neighborhood disputes, if it had ever truly been about those things to begin with. The Morrisons weren't playing a petty game, they were operating on an entirely different level. And while I had been documenting them, they'd been doing the same to me, only they'd started long before I had, with the skill and resources of people who knew exactly how to dismantle someone's life when they became inconvenient. If you were in my place, would you walk away or double down? The moment Frank turned and walked off, I called Sarah. My voice stayed steady, even though my pulse was racing and my fingers trembled like I'd overdosed on caffeine. Her response chilled me more than Frank's veiled threats. "Perfect," she said. "He just took it from civil to criminal. Now we can finish the AMA completely and publicly." Her confidence should have comforted me. Instead, it made me question if I was ready for what finishing them actually entailed. Because while I had the goods on the AMA broken bar, they had plenty on me, too. Footage of me on the property, impersonating a resident. If this came crashing down, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be a spectacle. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and I put together what she ominously referred to as our nuclear option, a legal strategy so destructive and thorough it made the concept of scorched earth seem polite. She'd already looped in the county recorder, the state attorney general's office for fraud, the IRS to explore any questionable tax activity tied to Brenda's crowdfunding, and probably a few federal agencies I'd never heard of. Apparently, government institutions take a dim view of people stealing land and then broadcasting it publicly like a victory lap. The paperwork was relentless, towering piles of forms, statements, affidavits. I began to understand why lawyers charge so much and why legal fights can drag on forever. Watching Sarah in action was like watching someone sculpt a missile from granite, both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Step 1 was proving, unequivocally, that I owned the land. Simple, right? It turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. The HOA had filed their own stack of documents, complete with professional surveys and descriptions that made it sound like the land had always belonged to them. For a moment, I genuinely thought we might lose it all, not because we were wrong, but because some outdated clause or obscure zoning language would strip us of everything. Sarah had to dig deep back into records from the original land grants, development plans, even handwritten notes from planning commissions long dissolved. We discovered that my ownership predated the HOA by 15 years. But for 2 agonizing days, our application sat in limbo, lacking what one official called definitive origin documentation. I almost gave up. I considered cutting my losses and disappearing, finding a new place to rebuild the peaceful lakeside life I dreamed of. But Sarah didn't flinch. She worked through the night, leaning on every professional favor she'd ever earned. And she found the original deed, the old boundary markers, and enough documentation to put any doubts to rest. We now had irrefutable proof. The land had never been within HOA jurisdiction. With that solid foundation, Sarah initiated Phase 2 with surgical precision. According to state law, if someone leaves property on land they don't own, and fails to remove it after receiving proper notice, The items can legally become the landowner's property under abandonment laws. Brenda, in her arrogance, had ignored every notice we sent her and even expanded her project. As a result, every single miniature house now legally belonged to me. The law was stunningly clear: ignore repeated, documented requests to remove your things, and those things stop being yours. Brenda had unintentionally gifted me 101 tiny homes. The same structures meant to discredit me now gave me leverage against her. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her final move was nothing short of genius. She handed me a clipboard and said, "You're the artist now. It's time for your debut." I took a laminated statement, stapled it to a stake, and drove it into the ground next to the 7th house. Instead of tearing down the tiny home as something that would have let Brenda paint herself as a martyr, I filed paperwork reclassifying the entire display as a public art exhibit. Title: Portrait of Suburban Tyranny. With one legal filing, we turned Brenda's monument to her ego into a legally protected art installation, a one with potential value in the tens of thousands. And best of all, it had been funded entirely through her own illegal fundraising activities. Sarah's documentation was airtight: a fortress built from audio recordings, fraudulent campaign evidence, and ownership records older than the HOA itself. Frank, desperate, filed a countersuit. He claimed the houses were community property, and that I was exploiting legal loopholes to steal neighborhood assets. I'm sure his attorney charged him a fortune to file those papers. They didn't last a week. The judge glanced through our evidence and dismissed the case in 3 days flat. The judge's ruling was clear: Frank would be better off hiring a criminal defense attorney than wasting more money on civil suits that had no grounding in law or logic. That was the moment I realized just how powerful properly prepared paperwork could be. I had reclaimed every square inch of my land, including the odd little homes built on it without permission, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I was in full control of the situation. The last phase of Sarah's plan involved a meticulously timed release of information, sending documentation simultaneously to law enforcement agencies, tax authorities, and select media outlets. It was a precision strike meant to expose Brenda's misconduct under the harshest possible light. And then, in the middle of an HOA event, Brenda abruptly yanked off her leadership sash mid-sentence and barked orders at George so loudly that nearby vendors paused in confusion. A few minutes later, she received the formal notice transferring ownership of the miniature houses to me. She scoffed in front of a crowd, loudly announcing she'd send a crew to clean up the mess by Monday and that her attorneys would be in touch about theft charges. What she didn't realize was that Sarah and I had already submitted a comprehensive report to the local press, the state attorney general's office, and the HOA outlining how Brenda had used fraudulent crowdfunding to raise money under false claims of property ownership and community endorsement. As she glanced at the installation sign I'd posted, something shifted. Brenda physically stepped back from it, as though it were toxic. Behind her, 2 residents silently peeled down an HOA event flyer from a wall. Brenda believed she was the queen on the board, moving her pawns however she pleased, rewriting the rules mid-game. What she didn't see coming was that I had flipped the entire board over and brought federal oversight to question whether her game should have existed at all. Then, without ceremony, Sarah pulled out her phone and began live streaming. "This is now a contested cultural zone," she narrated calmly. "Per county guidelines, all activity is frozen pending review." But as I watched the unfolding chaos, a strange question rose: would winning actually feel like victory? Would justice bring satisfaction or something else? I left the stage and made my way toward the media crowd that Sarah had discreetly invited. Journalists stood ready, cameras already rolling. I'd prepared a single sentence for them. Just one. The emergency home meeting that Brenda had called her attempt at salvaging control became something else entirely. It was 2 glorious hours of poetic justice. A spectacular implosion of everything she had built on lies and bluster. Brenda had meant for the meeting to serve as my public downfall, the moment she would banish me and assert her power once and for all. But instead, the tables had turned. This became her very public unraveling, watched by neighbors, reporters, and law enforcement representatives who were already quietly investigating her. The community center was packed to the walls, but not just with curious residents. Sarah had arranged for local news teams to attend, framing it as a human interest story about neighborhood disputes and grassroots property rights. None of them realized they were about to witness the dismantling of a suburban tyrant. Brenda started the meeting in full command, speaking with her usual conviction, but something in her demeanor had changed. The small tells, the tension in her jaw, the stumbles in her speech. She was beginning to sense a shift in power, though she hadn't yet seen how steep the fall would be. She claimed that a rogue homeowner was threatening the harmony of the entire community, undermining collective progress in favor of selfish property rights. Her speech, ironically, nailed the truth, just not in the way she intended. Yes, decisive action was needed, but it wasn't mine that was selfish. When Brenda finally called on me to defend my obstruction of the HOA's project, I stood up calmly, holding a folder thick with evidence. My smile wasn't warm, it was sharp, predatory. The room fell into silence, so complete that the soft rustle of clothing and even breaths felt loud. I didn't need the microphone she'd been using to dominate the room. My voice carried effortlessly. "I'm not here to destroy what was built illegally," I said, making eye contact with her. "I'm simply reclaiming what is lawfully mine under the very same property statutes this community is supposed to respect." The silence that followed was even deeper. Somewhere, a camera shutter clicked. A murmur passed through the back row as someone asking their neighbor what abandoned property laws actually meant. I went on to explain it all, how legal notice had been given, how no action had been taken, and how, under state statutes, the ownership of the structures had transferred to me. I described how the fundraising tied to false claims of ownership constituted fraud violations not only of state laws, but potentially federal ones as well. Then I held up the official registration for Portrait of Suburban Tyranny, the art installation born from Brenda's illegal project, now legally mine, and appraised as a significant cultural asset. The piece titled Portrait of Suburban Tyranny was officially appraised at $25,000 and set to be auctioned within a month. Every dollar earned would go toward a legal defense fund supporting victims of HOA abuse and misconduct. The collective gasp from the crowd was a melody of awakening, a symphony of realization that the tables had well and truly turned. The so-called troublemaker had outmaneuvered the system through deliberate planning, relentless patience, and superior legal precision. Brenda's reaction was even more satisfying than I'd hoped. She completely unraveled, screaming about lawsuits, constitutional violations, and accusing me of manipulating bureaucracy to turn communal property into personal profit. Ironically, everything she said on camera served only to highlight how little she understood about property law or the consequences of ignoring it. Meanwhile, the media's cameras didn't miss a second. Frank attempted to pull one of his usual intimidation stunts on a group of reporters, stepping toward them with the same threatening posture he'd used for years to bully people who couldn't push back. But his timing was off. Officers were already on site with a warrant in hand thanks to Sarah's meticulous evidence of his harassment and threats. He didn't get far before the cuffs went on. George, trying to dodge the fallout, blurted, "That's not my signature." But when someone showed him a printed record of a wire transfer, he froze. His awkward laugh died in silence, and no one found it funny. From that moment, the dam broke. As Frank was marched out in cuffs with the whole neighborhood watching, and neighbors who had been afraid to speak up began telling their own stories. Accounts poured in about extortionate fines, forced renovations, and families driven away by a mix of financial pressure and pure intimidation. My story was just the tip of the iceberg. George admitted that his signature had been forged on multiple documents. 3 more residents stood up and said their names had been fraudulently used on official HOA paperwork. Then the woman who owned the local hardware store revealed that Frank had been charging personal items to the HOA, funding his wife's vanity projects and their lifestyle with community money. A retired school teacher recalled how Brenda had nearly forced her into bankruptcy by issuing fines over a garden she'd planted decades ago before the HOA even existed. She was accused of breaking architectural guidelines based on complaints that turned out to be fabricated. The stories came non-stop, a flood of grievances and horror stories that made it crystal clear. This wasn't just about one conflict. It was a pattern of unchecked authority cloaked in a veil of community leadership. When it was all said and done, The HOA board, previously too afraid to confront Brenda, voted unanimously to strip her of all authority. She was removed from every position instantly. George offered to serve as interim president while the group worked to rebuild the HOA from the ground up, at this time with real transparency and actual service to the neighborhood. During that meeting, a small child tugged on Brenda's sleeve and asked quietly, "Are you in trouble now?" She didn't answer. Her HOA badge slipped from her hand and landed in the grass. Brenda left that gathering without a word. No applause, no support, just a long, silent walk past the very neighbors who had once feared her and now looked at her with a blend of disappointment and contempt. No one stopped her. No one wished her well. 2 weeks later, both Brenda and Frank were formally charged with multiple offenses of fraud, intimidation, tax evasion, and conspiracy, all tied to their misuse of HOA funds and money collected through deceitful crowdfunding efforts. A month after that, under George's leadership, the new HOA passed sweeping reforms. They imposed strict limits on fines, required transparent voting, introduced an appeals process, and created oversight systems to guard against future corruption. 3 months in, my art piece sold for $25,000 at auction. The full amount was donated to launch a statewide legal defense fund for homeowners fighting back against corrupt HOA regimes, turning Brenda's scam into a tool for justice elsewhere. 6 months after the ordeal, the miniature houses were finally gone, the land restored to its natural beauty. I sat in a new cabin by the lake, the one that made me fall in love with the property in the first place. The silence wasn't exactly peaceful, a broken bar, but it wasn't home music blaring through hidden speakers either. That, for now, was enough. Brenda did leave behind a legacy, just not the kind she intended. She became a living lesson in what happens when authority goes unchecked. It implodes. And sometimes the most effective way to defeat tyranny isn't to destroy it, but to drag it into the light and let people see it clearly. Funny thing, I saw nothing attracts attention quite like a neighborhood that was never supposed to exist. Every now and then, I still drive past the edge of the property just to remind myself that it's really over. The signs are gone, the surveillance is gone, and so is Brenda, stripped of every shred of power she once wielded. If there's a takeaway from all of this, it's that you don't always need to knock down doors to get back what's yours. Sometimes, all you need is patience, the right paperwork, a broken bar, and a very public record. If you've stuck with me this far, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Ever had to deal with a power-hungry HOA? And if you like this one, consider clicking that little thanks button below. Catch you in the next chapter. This story may be over, but HOA Stories has a whole archive of chaos waiting for you. Pick your next rabbit hole wisely.